My name is Johanne Pelletier. I work here at Concordia in communications as Director of Strategic Initiatives, and I'll be helping moderate the question period. First, some housekeeping. So we're recording this webinar and we'll share it with our alumni in a couple of days. Some details about the Zoom webinar platform. Your participation is key, so we encourage you to ask questions. You've already, so many of you, know where the chat box is, but be sure to add your questions there. We'll be monitoring the chat environment, so offer us questions, we'll relay them to Leigh. She'll be answering partway through and again at the end of the webinar. These webinars are about your learning, so we really want to hear your questions. Now, our speaker, Leigh Kinch-Pedrosa. Leigh completed her BA in English Literature here at Concordia in 2012. She's General Manager of Confabulation Montreal, an organization dedicated to the growth of storytelling in Canada. She's one of the founders of the Confab StoryLab. This is Confabulation's education arm, and through the lab, she's led workshops for the Lister Family Engaged Science Initiative at McGill, Concordia's District 3 Startup Incubator, Concordia's Faculty of Arts and Science Publish or Perish program, and the Concordia Graduate Summer School for Counter-Radicalization Education. She's also contributing editor for Salon LL of Linda Leith Publishing and the creator of Food Core, a new culinary learning experience at the Phi Center in Montreal. We're so pleased to welcome Leigh to share her expertise with us. Over to you, Leigh.
Thanks, Joanne. So as Joanne said, I'm Leigh Kinch-Pedrosa. I'm the General Manager of Confabulation, an organization dedicated to the growth of storytelling as an art form, as a community building tool, and as a professional skill. Confabulation began as a monthly live show and has since grown to offer educational programming, a podcast, and other special artistic projects with our many partners. But no matter how much we grow, the live show and the storycraft that we develop there remains at the core of our activities. Today, my goal is to share with you the fundamentals of storycraft. Storytelling is an art form, but it is also a skill that is transferable to the workplace and to other artistic practices and to your own personal life. It uses, in my opinion, its uses are pretty limitless. There we go. So we will start by discussing the importance of storytelling, as well as a few of its applications. I'll tell you a story. Then we'll talk about the elements of storycraft, using my story as an example. I'll provide you with some fundamental tools for storytelling, and then finally answer any questions that you might have, and Joanne will kindly moderate that discussion. So why is storytelling important? The answer is very simple. Humans connect to humans, and what is more human than a story? There is a ton of research across many fields that confirms storytelling as a skill that humans have employed for as long as they've had language. It is a method of sharing information in a way that is engaging and memorable. On the Origins of Stories, Brian Boyd writes that humans are hyper-intelligent and hyper-social. Storytelling capitalizes on both these human qualities to convince, connect, inspire, and remind. When we want mood experiences, we go to concerts and museums. When we want meaningful emotional experiences, we go to the storyteller. So that's Robert McKee, who writes a pretty fundamental book on story. Emotions are so often characterized as having no place in business or in the workplace. I would argue that that is outdated. That it doesn't account for the great power that emotions wield. Emotions can inspire. They can inspire people to follow you, to follow your vision, to hire you, to buy your product, and work in a way that you see as most efficient. Storytelling conveys information, yes, but it also conveys emotion. And with information and emotion, you can get a lot of stuff done. So in what context is storytelling relevant? In personal branding, this is especially important if you are a freelancer like I am. Many careers aren't as definable as they once were. Some of us have patchwork careers that are more difficult to describe when we are asked, what do you do? Marketing. Google storytelling and you will find 10,000 responses for storytelling and marketing. I could go on and on about storytelling and marketing and content marketing, but that would be a whole other webinar. Interviews. Interview questions haven't changed to reflect the shift in the work paradigm that is the gig economy. We all still get, what is your greatest weakness as a question, and we all still answer perfectionism. Responding to an interview question with a really good story will make you stand out from other applicants. And the great thing about these formulaic questions is that you can prepare some stellar story answers in advance. Leadership. Employees or collaborators work so much harder when they believe in what they are working on. Storytelling is a way more effective method of conveying your vision than just listing your goals. It'll also give you a more personal connection to anyone you work with. Finally, troubleshooting. The process of solving problems is in itself a story. The protagonist or hero in every story is essentially trying to troubleshoot a problem. If you can identify the elements of story within your problem, you can better strategize the solving of said problem. If you would like to discuss any of these storytelling in any of these contexts with more details, I'm open to doing so after the webinar and will provide you with my contact information. So with that, here's my story. Being a freelancer means sitting in a lot of cafes between meetings. My clients range from jewelry designers to coffee roasters to charter bus services. Not one project is the same, but they always include a client meeting. So I'm between meetings a lot, and sometimes emails come in at weird times, and I realize that I don't read them as well as I should. In one of these in-between meeting times, I'm in a sandwich shop downtown with an hour and a half between meetings and not enough time to go back to my home office. The shop, with its cold cut smell and fluorescent lights and noise, isn't the best place to work, but it has to do. Freelancers work anywhere. I'm about to meet a professor who runs a summer school for graduate students. Last week, as I worked in a cafe in Ferragudo in the south of Portugal, where I was on vacation, I read an email from this professor asking if I'd like to teach a one-day storytelling workshop to a bunch of graduate students. I love working with graduate students. They have their own passions and expertise, and they're usually extra keyed in. So I quickly fire off a response saying I'm interested and would love to meet when I'm back in the country. So back to the sandwich shop. I have my headphones on to some light Chopin piano that I usually use to cut out the world. And I'm scrolling through my phone looking for that email from the professor. Give it a quick review before our meeting to make sure I have all my talking points in order. The email is there. It's pretty clear that I've missed a word, a very important word, when I first read it. You see, I was not asked to teach a workshop on storytelling at the Concordia Graduate Summer School. I was asked to teach a workshop on storytelling at the Concordia Graduate Summer School for counter-radicalization education. Thing is, I don't know anything about counter-radicalization education. I don't know anything about radicalization. And I have this meeting in an hour with a professor who is really well-respected and intelligent and accomplished and so very intimidating. I can't cancel the meeting. That would be unprofessional. More unprofessional than misreading an email because the sun in Portugal is warm and the pastries are delicious and the seagulls fly at night and the whole place is my own personal la-la land. But I am professional. I'm a make-do, work-when-you-can, resourceful freelancer. And I do have storytelling expertise, and I have taught workshops before. So I go into the meeting with honesty and openness. I sit across from the professor. He is kind, enthusiastic about his work, and he leans in with perfect eye contact when he listens. I tell him the truth. I have no background in counter-radicalization, but I do have a love of experimentation and learning. I tell him that the tools of storytelling can be transferred to any field. and he agrees. I tell him that storytelling is more than a way of sharing information. It is a way of building confidence. He nods. I tell him that storytelling is about connecting humans, an essential aspect to projects of counter-radicalization. And he smiles. We have a lovely conversation, and he hires me. That workshop ended up being a truly formative experience for me. I learned so much from the students, each specializing in different fields, each passionate, each astute. By mistake, I had put myself in a situation where I wasn't totally comfortable, but I forced myself to dive into a new subject, to reflect on my own knowledge, and maybe most importantly now, to take extra care with all future emails. Freelancers work anywhere. We are always learning. So that's my story. It's a little bit longer than maybe one that you would tell in an interview context, but it could probably answer any number of questions. And if I had it prepared in advance, I could curate some of the details to respond to the specific questions. It could respond to what is your weakness. It also works for what is an example of learning for you. What is a formative experience in your career? Any of these, and I can pick and choose details to accommodate that. So as we move into the next two slides, where I discuss the elements of story, I would like you to think about and identify some of the points at which I use these elements. So please add your responses to the discussion, and Joanne will help me discuss them after the next two slides. These are the elements of story, or at least some of them. Within the story I just told you, there is a narrative arc. Simply put, a narrative arc follows the protagonist's change as they encounter obstacles and overcome them. Your protagonist, you, if you are telling a story about yourself, should be changed, affected by the end of your story. And the events or scenes of your story should contribute to that change. You can't have a story without a narrative arc. Otherwise, you're just listing stuff that happened. So there are four main elements that contribute to a narrative arc, providing it, and by extension your story, with the energy and tension required to keep a listener listening. Character. As I already mentioned, you at least need a protagonist. In my story, the protagonist is me. There are certain character traits that I exhibit that direct the flow of the story. That leads to goals. It is important that I can identify what my protagonist's goals are within the story. In this case, I need to know what my goals are. Obstacles. There has to be something standing in the way of me obtaining my goals. Otherwise, it isn't interesting. If there's nothing for a character to overcome, there is nothing for the character to do. One note about obstacles: the obstacles could be the protagonist's own habits or hang-ups. And finally, stakes. Stakes are why it matters. What does the protagonist have to lose if they do not achieve the goal? Here's where we inject our story with humanity, making it more than just a series of events that happened. When you add touch points, points of connection for your listener to experience with you, they are brought into your world, ultimately making them more sympathetic to you and receptive to the information you are trying to share. So parts of this human experience that we would share are setting. Where does the story happen? But tell me more than where it happens. What is the historical context of the story? Is it 2018 in Canada? Is it 1990 in South Africa? Those are really different historical contexts. What is the psychological state of the protagonist? Are they reliable? Next, we have cultural touch points. A detail from a specific culture can be a point of connection to someone who has experienced the same culture. So for instance, I talk about hopping between cafes as a freelancer. I would argue that freelancing is a type of culture, and that hopping between cafes is really specific to the culture of freelancers. It's also a point at which other cultures could find recognition. Everyone's been to a cafe. Senses. Tell the listener what you see, yes, but also describe what you smell, feel, hear, taste. Activate the listener's sensory memory. It'll make your story more dynamic. And finally, back to emotions again. Try and find a creative way of sharing how your protagonist feels within a story. This is really important because you want your listener to share and sympathize. And when I talk about emotions, I don't mean that we all need to participate in some big Shonda Rhimes melodrama, though I love Shondaland. Remember, passion is an emotion, energy, excitement. These are very useful emotions to have flying around a conference room, an interview, a pitch session. So, did anyone identify where I employed the elements of story? Do you have any?
Well, I think Leigh is throwing a question out at us. Maybe, Leigh, can you go to your next slide quickly? Period for questions. In a way, we're watching time. It's as a reminder for you to think about those questions. These elements of storytelling, for instance, how would you use these in the context of your professional life, in your work life, in an interview? Maybe think about those, and we'll have Leigh carry on with some more to help you generate those questions.
So if we want to look back at some of these and think about like what I used, how I employed these in a story. So for instance, I had to think about what were my goals in as the protagonist in telling this story. I want the job. I want to work with this really well-respected professor. I also financially require, the output of this interview to be positive. So knowing that goal helps me think about the other elements of the story, thinks about the stakes, thinks about the obstacles. On to obstacles, I mentioned when I described it that obstacles can be something within the protagonist. Obstacle for me is my own difficulty reading emails and reading them as carefully as I should. An obstacle for me is running around and not having a setting in which I work as like a regular office person. The setting is a cafe. If it's a sandwich shop, you can probably guess which sandwich shop is. There's a really particular smell to it that isn't necessarily conducive to being an office space. So I've kind of taken these details, the sensory details. I talk about the smell, the fluorescent lights, to try and bring you into that space with me in order for you to like sympathize with me, the freelancer. So you see more than just, or at least hopefully you see more than just a freelancer who didn't read an email properly, but you see someone who actually does care, is just sort of running around and trying to figure out like how to make work happen.
Can I interject? I'm physically raising my hand here. It's Johanne here. I would say what's interesting about that kind of story is that popular in interviews now is an acknowledgement of a frailty, like the thing you don't do well. But also what's powerful is acknowledgement about learning. Because lifelong learning is so critical in our workplaces, the acknowledgement that just whatever your background is and the credentials you bring to the interview, that you are expressing, you are continually learning.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We all have our frailties, and the best thing you could do with a frailty or a weakness is know how to deal with it, as opposed to ignoring it.
I think what's interesting is when I heard Leigh's story the first time, I thought, well, maybe all of us should have in our pocket a story about how we learn, that we tilt and use in our workplaces and in interviews, and that we modify over the years, because it's a huge thematic in the workplace now.
Mm-hmm. So let's go over to the 4 storytelling tips, just to get you started in terms of how to create your own story. So first off, you might want to select the details that serve a story. Some things that may seem pertinent, humorous, emotionally astute to you, but in the context of a story, in the context of an interview, they may not be as useful. So, also you don't have 25 minutes to share this really big, long story about yourself. So sharing every single detail of your memory isn't necessarily the best way to get the story across. you want to be selective. Here's what I suggest. The first step to preparing a story is to brainstorm everything you remember about the event. Everything. Get it all out. Then when you're exhausted, get ready for more work. Look at all these details. Ask yourself why you would share those details. How do they serve the story? How do they create a setting? How do they exemplify your passion? How do they tell us about the stakes or the obstacles? What does it do to make the story better? If you can't answer those questions about a detail in your story, get rid of it. Think about what your audience wants to hear. When I was in that sandwich shop, I ordered a sandwich and it had 3 different cold cuts on it and lettuce and a lot of hot peppers. Do you care? I don't think so. Every time I share something unnecessary, it's a time at which that I could lose your attention, that you could stop caring about what I have to say. So my next tip is to package information. When you tell a story, you are trying to share information. I shared information with you about the importance of thoroughly reading emails. I shared the information by creating a scene in which I read the email too quickly because I was enjoying a vacation. Then I shared another scene in which I realized I had read it incorrectly. And then I shared a third scene where I rectified the situation. In each scene, I use active language. By that I mean I select verbs to describe what I'm doing. I set what I'm doing in a world that you can imagine. That's a scene. And it's way more effective it's a way more effective way of communicating information than just telling you it's important to read emails. Another way to think about this is to think about it as cinematic thinking. When you watch a movie, you are seeing the actions the characters take. You are seeing the world in which they take those actions. Imagine that you are a director in your own story. I mean, you are effectively. Be yourself. I often perform stories at confabulation events in front of audiences as a work of art. And that is not the only context that I tell stories in. I tell my kids' stories, I tell my clients' stories, I tell my cell phone providers' customer support line stories when my phone breaks. I tell stories every single day, and the contexts differ, but they're always a performance of one kind or another. There's always an audience, even if it's just an audience of one. That might sound like I'm always on, but to me that just means that I know what I'm going to say. Telling stories to an audience, it's a natural thing. It's human. So let's keep it that way. Be yourself. Know who you are within the story, know what your goals are, and know how you would react. Use outside thinking. I just gave you a ton of information about storycraft, and those are just the fundamentals. There's so much to think about when you tell stories, and so many ways to make your stories exceptional and unforgettable. When you tell a story, you're going to be juggling a lot of tools, information, feeling, but you still have to remember that you're telling a story in a room to a person or some people. You want to respond to that. And that doesn't mean, stopping your story and addressing whatever weird reaction, laugh, sigh, eye roll of boredom personally, but it does mean, nodding back, smiling back, maybe responding verbally if it feels appropriate in the context, or if you feel confident enough to do so. The other great thing about outside thinking is that you can feed off the energy of your listener. If they're leaning in, it means that they like what you're saying, or at least they're interested in it. And that's a great confidence boost that you can use when you're telling a story. So do you want to open it up to questions?
Yes, thanks very much, Leigh. Very much looking forward to your questions. So I'm hoping you're thinking about questions for Leigh about how you might use storytelling. Leigh, maybe you could respond. I had a question for you about. Let's say, assume I've never performed in front of an audience. I've never actually composed a whole story, much as you have done. What are ways to be more aware of the stories we hear? So in the workplace, in an elevator, at home with my family, how might I get more aware that I'm hearing stories, this very human thing?
Well, one of the things you could do is to just start seeking out stories and being able to identify those elements of stories. And then I think it happens kind of naturally after that. So podcasts right now are insane in terms of story content. There are so many. The Moth, Confabulation has a podcast. You could just listen to a bunch of them and, you know, hear what I'm talking about and sort of see that, you know, these aren't just stories these aren't like huge stories where everybody's dangling off the end of the cliff. They can really be small. They can be about misreading an email. They could be, you know, they could be anything. They could be about grief. They could be about loss. And you can see that like your whole life is made up of stories. There's a guy named Matthew Dix who runs a storytelling show, and he's also on the Salon, the Slate. Anyway, he's got this podcast. His name is Matthew Dix. And he has an exercise that he calls homework for life. And he essentially has a spreadsheet, and every single day he writes down in point form, it takes him 30 seconds, he writes that one thing that could be a story. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a fully fledged story. It could just be a moment that made him think about his life. I'm an avid journaler. It seems like this huge thing that you have to take time out of your life to do, but if you just write something down every once in a while. Also look at, you know, social media is full of stories. There's a thing called Instagram stories. You can look at those every day and see just what other people are putting out in the world. And then, you know, as you get a basis for it, you can go out and live your life as a story-worthy life. That's what Matthew Dix calls it.
A story-worthy life.
A story-worthy life, which I would argue is anyone's life.
Well, we have a couple of great questions that have come in, so should we jump into those? So the first one I see is from Raja. Thanks, Raja. Do you rehearse your stories before telling them to an audience, or is it improvised?
Oh, I rehearse. I'm a writer by trade, so I put a lot of effort into the particular words that I choose. I rehearse a lot. I tell stories to my phone, and then I play it back to me just to hear it. There's a lot you can do. There's a lot you can learn from listening to yourself, finding your hang-ups. I say actually a lot, and I learned that through listening to myself. That's not the only thing that you could do, too. I work with a lot of professional storytellers who plan a story. There's definitely work in Storycraft to do, and then they write down 10 keywords and just improvise from those 10 keywords, knowing the beats, knowing the marks that you have to hit. So depending on who you are, the type of learner that you are, you can sort of adapt to that.
Okay. Another question from Julie. Thanks, Julie. How do you juxtapose the effectiveness of storytelling with decreasing patience of people to listen or read in our online status world? So that lends itself to story fragments that are serialized.
That's a really interesting question. I think a lot about that. I think a lot about it as online world and offline world. In offline world, like this is a picture from Confabulation, and you'll see that we're sold out. People keep coming to our shows because they actually want to hear stories. They're interested in what they have to say. At Confabulation, yes, it's a performance, but like it mimics to a certain extent what you would do when you're just talking across the dinner table with somebody to share an interesting story. People are engaged and they listen, and I don't necessarily think that people's patience or that their attention span is limited. I just think that there's so much out there that can take them away. So I guess when you're in the right context, when you're in an interview, they're there to listen to you. When you're with your friends, hopefully they're there to listen to you too. When you're at an event like this, when you are pitching your business model, those people are there to listen to you. I also say don't necessarily talk for 25 minutes. So,
Okay. More questions coming in. Thanks, Kyle. with his question. I'd be curious to hear about your position, excuse me, of the ethical responsibility between story embellishment and story exaggeration. And he cites his fiancée as a great storyteller. The problem is, or that he feels, the stories are embellished or emphasized for extra punch.
That's interesting. The confabulation subline is stories as true as we can tell them. I wouldn't lie to anybody, but I also have my memory, and my memory is always going to be colored by who I am and my perspective on the world. Joanne, you and I could be in that same sandwich shop together and we could see it differently and you could smell something differently, but I'm in charge of the story. So I get to tell you what my experience is of it. In terms of embellishment, I think there are ways to dramatize things without lying. You can also lean into, when I say that there are 10,000 Google hits on storytelling and marketing, I don't actually know that number, but I can say there are 10,000 and you know that I'm pulling that out. You know that the number is a lot, and that's just what I'm trying to get at. I also give people credit too. My listener is an intelligent person. They can tell when I'm embellishing for dramatic effect and when I'm lying to them. So yeah.
So your audience would be a critical factor there too, right? So that what you embellish and how you embellish in an interview is going to be different than what you embellish in the rendition of the same story with drinks, with friends, having drinks.
You're telling the same story. You're just talking more about different details.
Okay. More questions. Thank you, Emily. With this question, aside from the fact that you're a storyteller working with a story, how did finding your personal story come together and help direct you towards what you now tell people what you do?
That's a good question. I change it every single time I talk to somebody. I have sort of prepared certain things for certain contexts, but I am a freelancer. My career is totally weird and patchwork, so it depends on the career I'm going for and the situation that I'm in. In this context right now, I'm telling you about my life as a storyteller. In another context, I would tell you about my life as a copywriter or my life as a producer for food events. It totally depends on the context. The story of me developing my career is a long, long novel, and there are scenes throughout it that are more pertinent to other parts of my career. I choose them, I develop them, and then I select them.
Do you think that, I think of storytelling and resume revising for me in my own practice as related things I do. That is, when I work on my resume or my LinkedIn profile, I think about what the story is about that piece that I'm revising, because then I know that I'm going to practice that story and it's going to be part of kind of my narrative of my work. Does that resonate at all with?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I'm a freelancer, so I have 25 employers. I'm not going to put 25 employers on my resume. I will select the ones that are the most pertinent to the job.
Thank you. More questions thank you, Mary. With this question, I'm currently applying to jobs and in interviews. The opening question is typically, tell me about yourself. How do I answer this in a way that is compelling and not just listing my previous experience?
I would think of a formative experience. What made you want to get into the field in which you're applying, or one that changed you? You can, there's so many different details to your life as a worker in whatever field that you're in, but you can, pick one that's dramatic. Pick a story that's dramatic, pick a story that changed you, pick a formative story, pick a story that is, that led you to where you are today, and just tell that story. You could even say, oh, I have a story about that, and then jump into it. Pick a scene, make a little movie. It's more interested in saying that, in 2012, I graduated from, Concordia with an English literature degree. 1,000 other people. Like it makes me stand out.
Great. Another question, thank you, Julie. Do you also help other people tell their own story? Can you share some tips on how to get stories out from people, especially when working with very rational people who are not used to sharing their emotions?
Yes, I can. That's my favorite thing to do, actually. As part of my work with Confabulation, I am a story consultant. I work with people from all different fields. I love working, as I mentioned, with graduate students and researchers. I've done some work with District 3, and that's one of the interesting ones because it's all about developing a pitch and developing a personal story that you can inject into a pitch. In a pitch, you need to talk about your traction and your numbers and your partners and your all of these details that you have to hit. And you have to package that information into a scene. And when you ask someone to do that, someone who's an engineer, and asking them to, delve into that emotional moment, they are immediately resistant. So the first thing I do a lot of the time is to just describe to them, this is why I love stories. This is what storytelling can do for you. This is what storytelling has done for me. You can find so many resources on the internet. You can take what I've said that, describe why storytelling is important. You can even look for examples within a field. You can look up pitch documents all the time and find them. I come in to a lot of these meetings with specific prompts in mind. One of my favorites to just get people going is to say, tell me a story about the first time you did something. Everyone has had a first. They've ridden a bike for the first time. They kissed a girl for the first time. Just get them telling any story, and that'll sort of get them going, and then they'll feel like, oh, I can do this. So.
I have another question, this time from Olivia. In your opinion, how does a story change or morph when it's written compared to when it's told live or in person, or, for example, a CV versus an interview?
In a CV, for instance, you're not necessarily going to write out a story because it is a little bit, you're not going to write out a story because there's a form in which you have to conform. But as Joanne and I were talking, there is a story that you are telling. You're selecting certain details and forefronting them. When you put a story in front of someone, it's that outside thinking effect. You see their responses, and you can kind of lean into certain moments. I watch a lot of storytellers on the confabulation stage get, knock me super scared before they get on stage, and then somebody laughs at their story and they come alive and they tell me more details and they respond, and it's really fun. So I think the audience is a huge aspect to that, and I think people react in ways that they even didn't know that they would react to.
Thanks, Leigh. A shout out to all our participants. If you have other questions, other stories that resonate with you, have you tried storytelling yourself? What's holding you back if you haven't? A question from Jessica. As a recycled freelancer, as a personalized French language coach with a diversified background in tutoring, arts, project management, sports, many things, any tips on how to pitch what I do to either my fans, I'm an artist, or any potential clients I randomly meet face to face?
I would think about the niche things that you're interested in. So for instance, when I talk about copywriting and stories, one of the things that I do as a copywriter is I'm really attuned to ethical copywriting, things that are gender non-specific, things that don't greenwash things that are really clear in that way. And so when I tell people what I do, I lean into the ethics of it, in that I am a copywriter who, with a background in storytelling, who really cares about ethics and ethically writing.
Okay.
Yeah, select the niche and lean in.
Select a niche and lean in. Okay, more questions coming in. From Sylvia, do you find that there's a certain type of person who's more receptive to storytelling? Over to you, Leigh.
No, I don't think so. I think it's pretty natural to humans. As a story listener now, I think if you get the right story, there's something that happened where everybody said that like business is business and it doesn't have any emotions in it, and so people think that that's how business is supposed to work. But you can crack that with a good story. And while people might not be as receptive to the idea of storytelling, a good story is going to turn on a listener.
That really resonates with me. I think my first contact with storytelling was when I left a job about 10 years ago. And the first thing I did was meet with an HR consultant who said, you need to work on your story. And I had no idea what they'd meant. I've never thought about my work as a story. And what he was asking me to do is really be able to convey where I was. I was in transition from one career to another. And to know how to do that, like not treat it as an embarrassment if there's a gap in your resume, or if you are a freelancer, or if you have a side hustle like so many people have, or more than one side hustle, to be able to speak to that in a compelling way and really own it is your story.
Yeah, I always like to say when you can tell your story, you can better imagine where you are going.
Ah, right. A question from Marie. Thank you, Marie. Can you share tips and tricks to write a concise personal statement in the context of a grad school application?
I've never written a grad school application. A concise personal story for writing a grad school application. Think about the formative moments. Think about maybe one like detail that you would like to
you'd play on your strengths.
Yeah, you play on your strengths and you know, figure out a time when you when those strengths were employed. So for instance, I could tell my story about this counter-radicalization education thing completely differently, leaning into the fact that like I'm a really open person. I really understand where I'm coming from. I really know what I'm talking about. Yeah, so play to your strengths and think about formative moments, and don't waste words.
And maybe practice, like practice or rehearse your. I think one of the mistakes I can think of in my career is that I may have had stories or way of describing things on my resume even that I haven't aired them with anyone. And what I do now is I test out, you know, if I'm going to tell a story or answer in an interview, I probably test it out with a storytelling colleague or professional colleagues and get their feedback. The more you practice speaking to who you are in that storytelling way, the more compelling you'll sound, the better you'll get at it. Kind of like writing, I guess. Right? Mm-hmm. The more you practice, the better you
that's get. What I was like, to go back to selecting the right details.
Right.
Get it all out, like we call it, you know, verbally or on the page or however you want to get it. Get everything out, and then just go at it with a hacksaw and take out anything that doesn't convey your strengths.
Thanks for that. We have another question from Fatima. Hi, rejoining workforce after being absent for many years due to personal situation. How do I tell the interviewer the why for being absent for so many years without inviting the listener's extreme sympathy to my situation and rather staying professional?
I think emotions are, you know, a good thing to employ, and I'm not trying to tell you to like get that extreme sympathy that you're talking about, but like show how you learned. It's a great opportunity to show that you are a stronger person than perhaps you were before these, you know, family situations or whatever it was that took you outside of your career. You can think about the ways that what you did outside of this workforce that you worked in, outside of your field, like how did that inform? I would use it. I would totally pick out what you would that illustrates your strength.
So don't be afraid of emotions. And I suppose the part of the good news is that in the modern workplace, transitions are really common. Side hustles are common. It's not that you have to. Many people have gaps in their resume, so addressing it and being authentic about it and is key. More questions coming in from Daniela. Thanks, Daniela. I really like the suggestion you mentioned about asking about a first experience to get someone to start telling a story. What tips would you suggest in another context, like networking?
Like to tell a story in networking?
Asking questions.
Oh, asking questions in a networking thing. I always like to say, like, is that something you've always done? Like, it's sort of leaning towards, is that something that you did as a child kind of thing? Like, it's everybody was a kid at some point, and you can get these really fun stories out of people and sort of disarm people by getting them to tell a story of their childhood, or getting, like, allowing you the opportunity to tell a story about your childhood and how, like, you know, if you're a storyteller, I was always telling these wild stories when I was a kid. The other great thing about getting people to tell stories about childhood, or telling stories about your own childhood, is that you have enough distance to really analyze it in a way that you know, you can pick out those really great details without being like too emotionally. Here's the weird balance that you have to make. You can't get completely emotional about it. You can't tell a story about a divorce that happened yesterday necessarily. That might be a little bit too much, but you can tell a story about an emotion that you felt as a child without getting overwhelmed. And that's particularly important, I think, in a networking situation.
It speaks to curiosity too,
Yeah.
doesn't it? That think about how you feel when you're at a networking event and someone expresses interest in hearing more about you. We respond well to that. So when you are networking, demonstrating a curiosity about others is a way to open up a channel.
And I would say that storytelling in itself is a networking opportunity. I mean, if you look at this picture again, that's at the Phi Center. That's a whole bunch of people who came out to meet Joanne, and they didn't know they were going to meet Joanne, but now they know Joanne. So sorry, that's Joanne in the picture.
Yeah, that's me. Yeah.
Like, that's a whole bunch of people who came out, didn't know they were going to meet Joanne. Now they know Joanne, and they have a personal connection to her, even though they just listened to her. So.
More questions coming in. Thanks, Leigh. From Sylvia, as a development officer in advancement, how can I draw an interesting story from a donor about their experience at the university, for example? Is there a best practice about how to formulate the question?
Openness and detail at the same time. So by that I mean, you want to ask a specific question, but allow the interpretations of those questions to be broad enough. One of my favorite confabulation themes that we've ever had was lies my parents told me. And that's super, super specific, but we got so many stories about people being lied to by any authority figure. So in terms of prompting people to tell you stories, figure out what you want to hear, first of all. If you are trying to, you know, get donor testimonials, you might want to talk, like, say something about whatever they're donating to, but yeah, open-endedness, but also details, because if you're too open, then people get lost and tell you a novel that you don't want to hear.
Maybe that Sylvia and others, but in particular on this question, Sylvia might want to follow up with Leigh after for something more specific on that piece as well, if she wants to hear more. More questions from Khaled. Any books recommended, we recommend for reading that it could improve one's storytelling?
There's an Ursula Le Guin novel, or not novel, but book that I cannot remember the title right now. But if you look up Ursula Le Guin, something about craft, on storycraft, something like that. She's really wonderful. There is a TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who the title of that talk is called The Danger of a Single Story. And she provides some really beautiful stories, but also speaks to the importance of storytelling. And it's a really great explanation to why we have storytelling couched into a story. It's brilliant. Anything by Emily Esfahani Smith. She is a writer for the New York Times, I want to say, and she writes a lot about cognitive narration and the ideas of deriving meaning and confidence from telling stories. I really like anything by Linda Barry. She is an educator and comic book artist, and she's really generous with her teaching tools. If you go on her Tumblr or her YouTube channel, there are a ton of exercises that you can do to help you build imagery and scenes, and help you journal, help you come up with ideas. But yeah, Linda Barry, Emily Esfahani Smith, Ursula Le Guin, Shimananda Ngozi Adichie are my top writers.
Great. I've just added to our collective chat that we'll ask Leigh to maybe put a short list of her top 5 together and send these on to you. We have another question from Kyle. Thanks again, Kyle. So Kyle's a business owner, real estate entrepreneur, many other things, loves the use of storytelling when presenting to a crowd, a seminar of investors, etc. But for business relationships, not for the pitch, he's asking, when I walk into a room of wealthy, seasoned investors, what's the approach?
I'm trying to think of a reference it's Simon Sinek is the writer, and he's got a TED Talk on the like the golden circles of description of what you do and what you're selling, and it talks about getting to the why and sharing a feeling as opposed to sharing what exactly it is you do. He's talking about the difference between Apple selling coolness, hipness, vivaciousness, and Dell saying we sell computers. Like, what do we want to buy into? So how do you inspire those emotions? And those are the kinds of things that you want to talk about. If you're in real estate, you're talking about finding people homes and getting people started in their lives. And to me, like that's a much more compelling thing to say rather than to say like I am, selling a house.
Another question from Jennifer. Thanks, Jennifer. How can you form a story about yourself for your personal brand? So she's starting a podcast where she is the brand and doesn't know about sharing that as a story.
Personal branding is so important now. And you really need to have something that you can refer to when you do your social media and digital marketing, when you go to pitches, things like that. And especially if you are selling your personal brand as a podcast, think about why you're doing the podcast. That's a really great place to start. How did you get here? Why did you do it? And then think about the really specific details that make you, you. Why do I want to listen to your podcast about you as opposed to the other podcasts about other people? I really like Getting Curious with Jonathan Van Ness from Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. And I want to watch that because he's this incredible, like, ebullient person who's health conscious, and he is a positive person. And I know that because he's told his story a couple times on Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, and he's got this really clear personal brand. So think about the things that make you special and weird and engaging.
Thanks, Leigh. Any other questions? I see that some people have contributed. Thank you, Temi, for giving us some of the reading list we've heard from Leigh. I don't see other questions coming in right now. Thanks for that podcast mention. It is a terrific one, Getting Curious. It's really fun. So because I don't see any more questions and our time is just about up, I want to thank Leigh for being with us this evening. It's great to have an alum participating on this topic. Thanks to you all for joining us and for your terrific questions. Please look out for the email from us within the next couple of days that it'll include a recording of the session and a survey. Your feedback is critical to help us improve the services and the events we offer here. Also, don't forget to follow Leigh in all the ways you'll see on this slide here. And if you want to connect with her after about storytelling craft, or perhaps even consider your own story live at Confabulation, contact Leigh. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.